Like I said, that way after we're done training, I can put it on the website and you can check it out at a later date. And it's fun because I have new owners all the time say they go back and watch the previous ones and they feel like they get to know each other or know some of the previous owners. So it might not feel like it right now because you're all kind of newer to your machines, not all of you, but most of you. But soon you're going to be like the more advanced quilters, right? And you'll be helping out the next wave of new long arm owners. So hopefully you're fine with that. Of course, you can always turn off your camera if you'd like, but it just makes me feel good seeing your faces, kind of puts face to name. So what I want to do before we even really get into the training session, I would love if you feel comfortable, take a moment and just introduce yourself, the machine you have, and if there's any issues you're having that you haven't already told me, any like, oh, if I could only figure out this one thing, I will feel much more comfortable about it. Nothing too drawn out, just to kind of give me an idea where we all are. So Wendy, I'm going to pick on you first. So if you don't mind.
Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Raleigh. I have an Amara just for about 6 weeks or so now. So I just loaded my first quilt, getting started, got all the way around till I had to wind it. So getting ready to start second row.
Nice.
I do have a question though about the tie-off mode versus what it is that you do. I'm having trouble with that.
Sure, I'll talk about that. Anything for you, Wendy? Wendy, on a side note, Wendy handles all our shipping for the shop and online store. So if you've ever had to reach out to our shipping department, it's Wendy. So grateful for all she does. And I'm just going by my screen. So Kira, you're next up. I know you're in the mode, but you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Kira. I have a Forte. I've had it since February. Just the issue with the bobbins or the bobbin thread sometimes nesting, but that's about it.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. How about you, Miss Loretta?
I'm Loretta. I have a Moxie and I've had it since about March. And I have a question regarding my thread shredding. And then somebody reminded me, what's the best way to start in the middle of a quilt, like raise your bobbin thread, or even stop and raise your bobbin thread to cut it and snip off without having this big long string of thread?
Yeah, tie off and tie on. I put together a little video for you, so I'll show you how to do that for sure. Good. I love it when you guys ask things I actually am prepared for. Sometimes I'm not, the questions catch me off guard. So far, so good. Jeannie, am I saying that right?
Yeah, Jeannie, is that me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I'm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I have the Moxie and I love it. Jeremy came and set it up for me, thank God, about the middle of May. I kind of figuring out, so I was having a lot of problems with the edge to edge because of the frame space. And then I came down to your class and that helped. I'm still kind of having problems, but I'm kind of tricking it. I mean, I just like fake it out, stop it, and then I restart it. Like, okay, that never happened. We're just going to pretend we're starting again. So that's a little bit, everything else is going really well. I'm loving it. So
good.
Carry on.
Good.
Sorry, I didn't like do my makeup or anything. So
well, I had like an extra 2 hours before I got here, and I was like, well, I might as well do my makeup. So that's the only reason.
You look beautiful.
Well, thank you. That's the only reason I look nice. My brother-in-law is getting married this weekend, and so I'm practicing my wedding guest makeup. So I don't normally look so made up. So don't get any illusions.
You look perfect. I've been doing yard work and stuff all day. So anyway,
well,
thank you.
You look great. You look great. You look great. How about you, Trina? How are you?
I'm doing fine. I have a Moxie, and sometimes I think that I should have gotten a bigger machine, but with the wider throat space, but I can't do that because I am limited on the width in my sewing room. So, but the problems I'm dealing with is the boxiness of my swirls. But I just finished a quilt and I said, forget it. I'm just going to quilt it. And it came out beautiful.
Awesome. Awesome. I know when a quilter says it came out beautiful, it must be stunning, because in general, quilters can be hard on themselves. So I'm glad to hear that you're proud of yourself. Awesome. Well, I'll talk about the different stitching modes and how some might be more, make quilting swirls a little bit easier. So we'll definitely talk about that. So good to see you again, Trina. Mary, I know we already kind of chatted, but if you don't mind doing it again.
I have the Moxie. I got it in, I think, July. It's a blur this summer. And I've struggled with it, to be honest, but I think it's just because I haven't really been able to get my hands into it. I finally figured out how to load a quilt thanks to your video. I
Good.
finally figured out how to do precision mode thanks to Jeremy. So first of all, thanks to Jeremy and Jessica and you for all the support. It's amazing. And my other issue that I'm having, like in precision mode, I think I'm worrying too much about the speed of the machine. You know how it speeds up and slows down with you.
Mhm.
I'm concerned about keeping the speed at a constant rate.
Mhm.
That's distracting me from everything. So,
Yep.
but
It's so when I talk about the stitching modes, I'll definitely talk about that. The quick answer I'll give you on that is you almost have to disregard the sound of the machine, because if you're constantly trying to make your hands match the sound of the machine's going to match the sound of your hands, and then you're just going to be in a spiral. So good pair of headphones or a glass of wine to distract you is always a great option. But I'll definitely, there you go. I'm always so jealous because I'm actually at the building. I'm at work, and I'm always like, man, I shouldn't drink wine at work, but I'm living through you vicariously, Mary. So no, we'll spend some time on that, because that definitely seems like that's bringing up a couple questions. So awesome. Thank you so much. CJ, it's so good to see you. You're happy feed.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing good. You want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your machine?
I'm CJ. I'm in Kansas City, and I have an Amara. Had it just over a month, I think now. I think I'm like to the point, like, well, I have that first sample or whatever thing that was on there.
Mhm.
I'm to the point I need to let something else new to practice, and I'm just kind of getting hung up on like, what do I practice? Like, what motifs do I try? I don't know, like what I don't know.
Yeah.
And like, what are like, if there's some that are maybe simpler than others, so that you kind of get more quick gratification. I don't know. So
Yeah.
you don't get like, so you don't like get down because
Yes.
like it all looks terrible.
Yep. Yep.
Not
So
that it
maybe
all looks terrible, because it
just
doesn't.
like
Because
a-
there's some things that I tried that looked okay, but
good. Just like a suggestion of where you go with your machine, like practice wise, kind of. Yeah. Okay. I can do that. Micro stippling, CJ, micro stippling. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Okay. Any other issues with your machine? I know you've only been through the one quilt, but any thread issues, tension issues, anything?
no, nothing that's really stood out.
Perfect. Good. Okay. All right. Hey, Deb, I'm so happy to see you on here.
Hello.
I shouldn't have favorites, but Deb is all of our favorites. She's like our Long Army mascot. She has the best stories. So if you ever get her aside, I mean, we'll just leave it at that. But Deb, will you introduce yourself to everybody?
Hi, I'm Deb McKernan, and I have a HQ16, which is old like I am, but also dependable like I am. And so therefore, and it speaks a lot to how long your HQ machines last, because this little machine just keeps going and going. I have two problems, well, that we can talk about.
Yeah. I was like, only two, Deb? Come on.
That is not rated inappropriate. First of all, I'm having a problem with that my thread slips out of the bobbin little slot thing. I'll be going around and all of a sudden I hear this little jamming sound, and I'll get the bobbin out, and the little bobbin thread is not in right.
Mhm.
That's my number one problem. My number two problem is I have an opinion. I free motion everything, and I am working on a quilt that I love, and I realized that when my thread had broken, and I threaded it back, it wasn't threaded quite correctly. So when I start rolling it, I see that my tension's not terrible on the back, but it could be better. So my question is this: do y'all rip that out, or do you just pretend like it's not there? That's my problems for the day.
Okay. I love it. Very good one. I'm going to go ahead and just answer the when to rip out question now, because there's really nowhere that fits in to the discussion.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and do it here. When it comes to your quilting stitch, the construction of the stitch is the most important thing. And as long as the stitch is holding, it's constructed, it's fine. And one thing that happens on the long arm is when it's taut, it's like everything is like there to see. When you take off the frame, it kind of eases in, and I think you might find that it will ease into it. So as long as the stitches aren't so loose that they're going to unravel, that's about it. So even if the tension is not correct as long as the stitch is still forming and it's not super loose. I think it's fine.
Just what I wanted to hear. Thank you, Angela.
Now, don't enter that quilt in a show and expect to win an award. But no, you give that to somebody, they're not going to know. You just make up something, Deb. I know you can be like, it's artistic. I love how the bobbin thread adds texture to the front, or whatever you want to say.
Or I could say, I really was having a lot of issues. I don't have very long to live and I was trying to hurry. So I hope you don't mind that this quilt has a few errors on it.
Yes.
But it might be my last one.
Yeah. And that's not the first time she's used that excuse, guys. So Deb retired and went back to school. So she's in college. And so she's used that. Anyway. Okay. Any other comments about that, ripping out stitches? Anybody have dealt with that or have anything to add to that or a question about that? Leave it to Deb to ask me a question. I haven't been asked before. So good job there, Deb. Let me ask you all this. Do I need, and it's okay, do you want me to go over how to load a quilt? Has everybody loaded a quilt? I can definitely do it, but is there somebody that's like, oh, I don't know how to do that? Because I can do it pretty quickly, or we can just jump right into the other stuff. No? Okay. So I will say this, I will kind of hit the overview here in a second. So let me pause by saying how the training session goes. So basically, this session is the perfect opportunity for you to ask your specific questions to make sure that you're comfortable with your machine. So we're not going to go into all the minutia of the machine, but definitely I'm going to hit the high points or hit the parts where some people or where I know like a lot of quilters struggle with. And so kind of like I'm your tour guide through the training session, but it is custom to you all. So as I'm going, if you have a question, please ask, because if you're thinking it, I guarantee you somebody else is thinking it. But I do understand that not everybody is as extroverted as I am. So if you're going along and you have a question, you can put it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, or you can reach out to me separately after the fact. It's totally fine. But I hope you feel comfortable asking it because it's a safe group, safe place to be. So I'm going to go ahead and just show a little bit about loading the machine. I'll just kind of go through it pretty quick, but then you can ask me any questions if you have them. And how this will work is I'll share my screen. So I've got all my training stuff all in one spot. But if you ask a question, I'll pop back on here. So we'll kind of be jumping back and forth. And again, it's very informal. So please don't feel like, you can't pop up and ask a question. So real quick, let me share. Do this real quick. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I got a new computer and it's like, oh, shoot. Hold on a second. It's not wanting to share. 1 second. Sorry, guys. It's all fun and games until.
Technology.
Okay. Uh-oh. Okay, shoot. Hold on 1 second. It's fun when everybody is watching me. It's so great. Let's see if it will do it. Okay, there we go. Can you see where it looks like Zoom? Okay. All right. So a couple of things, common issues, or a couple of things that a lot of quilters are see, or, things that I know that can be a little confusing. First of all, let's talk about the way your frame is set up. So I think everybody here has a frame, not the little foot, but like an 8 or 10 or 12 foot frame, whether that's the gallery or the Studio 2. Look at these two photos, show you the different options that the setup of your frame can have. Can you see my cursor over here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first thing I want to point out is depending on how you set up your machine or Jeremy set it up, you might have a different configuration. Now, what's really cool about the Studio 2, the loft isn't this way. So for Moxie owners, I think you can just like hesitate for a second. No, wait, I think the Moxie is. Anyway, depending on how your frame is set up will determine how you load your quilt. So I just want to kind of give you a heads up to check your owner's manual and make sure that you're using the correct bars as you're doing that. So this one over here is called our standard view. And this is what my machine has because I have an older Avante. And so I don't have the ability to change the configuration. And so if you have the standard view, it will look like your two bars are kind of like really close to each other, almost like right next to each other, but one is slightly higher. In that layout or that setup, the bottom bar will be for the back, and you can kind of almost see it right here. And then your top, this other bar will be for your quilt top if you choose to pin your quilt top. We'll talk about that here in a second. But a few years ago, Handy Quilter came out with the option for the clear view. And this is really neat. So what happens is now it's almost like those two bars are shifted and they're on top of each other almost, not exactly, but, and in that case, the top bar will be for your backing. So as you're trying to load your quilts, if you're watching the wrong video on Handy Quilter, or if you think, oh, that frame looks a little bit different, that is the reason why. Really, as you switch between the two, it's up to a personal preference for you. The clear view allows you to use rulers and not have to worry about bumping into this bar, whereas the standard kind of keeps everything up a little bit more. So if you are interested in changing the configuration, email Jeremy. Really, however you have it is fine, but just know that if your bars look a little different, the way you load it will be a little bit different. Any questions on that? I don't want you to do anything and get confused. So what I did one time is I made a video, and you might have seen this if you watching the prior training videos. I kind of just did a quick video of me loading a quilt. Now, the one thing I want to talk about is as you learn how to load your quilts and as you work through that process, you're going to find your own style. You're going to find the way that you like to do it. And all the owners I have, all the ones I've trained, everybody does it slightly different, and that's okay. So I always say, if it works, right? So if you do it a slightly different way, that's okay. If you start out like me and you change, that's okay too. So there's no perfect way to do it. So the reason I go into all that is I do what's called a float. So I don't pin my quilt top to any bars or leaders. I let it float and hang down. So that's going to show you, this video will show you how I do that. In fact, I took the bar off. I only have one bar down here because I just took that other one off. It's not suggested, but one of the benefits of being married to the tech is, I can usually get away with stuff like that. So when I show you how I float this, and I'll kind of talk through it, but Handy Quilter's videos usually show you how to do a full pin, or you pin the top. It's totally up to you. And so I'm just showing you a different option to work with. When you're loading your quilt, number one, you want to make sure your backing is bigger on all four sides, at least 4 inches on each side. So add 8 inches to your quilt top. And it doesn't matter how long I've been quilting. This is a quilt for Tula. I'm still double checking it. I trust her, but not that much. And so I'm double checking to make sure the backing is big enough. Of course, you could measure it out, but I just visually look at it because that will help me make sure that it's the correct size. Now, if you're working on your own quilts, you don't have to worry about that as much. But if any of you plan on quilting for customers, this is going to be very important. I'm going to pause real quick and say that we are a family, and that's why I'm in my stretchy pants and in a not flattering way. So there we go. You guys can see that I'm not always wearing all the makeup. So we're going to start with your quilt back first, and you're going to load that face down, pretty side down, makes sense, right? Because you want that on the facing outside. When you're loading your frame or loading your quilt, you don't have to perfectly center it on your leaders, but some people do find it helpful to mark the center point on their leaders and match that up to the center, so they kind of have that visual bit. Is there anybody here watching that doesn't have the ability to walk behind their machine? For instance, their machine is all the way back to a wall and they have to work from the front completely. Loretta? Okay.
Yeah.
There's a couple. Perfect. There's one little bitty difference I'll show you here in a second. Now, one thing I want to talk about is I pin my quilts. I'm old school. I realize that the older I get, the more stuck in my ways I am. So what I'm doing here is I'm just lining the edge of my backing with the edge of my leader, right? So I'm just lining those up and I'm going to pin it in place. Now, there are some aftermarket things that you can get that will, snappers and zippers and such, but I always use the pins, and it doesn't matter where you pin it. Like, it doesn't have to be a 1/4 inch. It could be closer to the edge. That doesn't matter. But go ahead and pin it either way, from the leader side or the quilt side. I will say though, I always pin it with my leader facing up right here. And you can kind of see that. The reason I do that is because that way the pins are always on top. But I find that newer quilters kind of freak out about things, and myself included when I was newer. Just pin that sucker on. You can pin from either side, whether it's the side with the backing on it or the side with the leader, just pin it on there. Now, you can't overpin it. So go ahead and add a pin every inch or so. And so here I'm just kind of filling in and pinning along that. This is a great thing to do if you have relatives over and you're hiding from them, but you can't quilt because it makes too much noise. So nice and quiet. But you're going to work your way along that whole one, pinning along there. Anybody have any questions so far? Let me pause real quick. No. All right. So basically I'm pinning it Now, one thing I want to show you, and I'll kind of show you this in a second. I didn't actually iron my backing. I don't ever press the backings because I know I have a little trick I'll show you in a second where you can just spritz it with some water. But I want to make sure that's all pinned and it's consistent, pinned as much as possible. Then I'm going to kind of smooth it out. Now here, I can get to the back of my machine just barely. If I gain any more weight, I'm not going to be able to, but I'm going to smooth it out and let it hang on the back so that I can start rolling it up. Now, since it does have those creases, I'm just lightly spraying it with water, or wrinkle releaser will work, just lightly spritzing it so that as I roll it up, it will help that smooth out. So if you don't love ironing, this should be a very, very happy news for you. But when you go to start loading your quilt, I'm going to start rolling it up along this bar. And this is the belly bar, but I'm just going to roll it and ensure that it's loading smoothly. Sometimes the edges will move a little bit, especially if it's not perfectly straight. I'm not too worried about that. But if it does start telescoping one direction a lot, that means I probably didn't pin it on straight, and I want to check that before I get too far. Now, this is what I do for quilts of all sizes. And so even like a tinier quilt, but I'm just turning, smoothing, turning and smoothing. Watch out for those pins, because if you poke your hand, it does hurt really, really bad. Now, one thing I don't think I've shown yet is, the cogs on the side of your frame, and there's a little ratchet that holds it in place. It has a little wheel and you turn it, it makes that sound. If you put those ratchets in the down position, the bar will only turn in the direction it should turn for loading a quilt. So that's a little hint right there. Now, this part is if you're able to get behind your machine. So Loretta, I'll talk through a different option here. But my rule of thumb when I'm loading a quilt is I get it to where the top of the back is touching the tabletop, because I need a little bit of extra for this next spot. So this next part. So what I'm going to do is take it and wrap it around that leveler bar, this extra bar right here, and then around to the top. Has anybody loaded their quilt and forgotten that? If
Yes.
so, congratulations, you're normal. It happens all the time. You're probably good for 3 or 4 of those, but that leveler bar serves a really important function. As the quilt rolls up on that take-up bar, it's going to get bulkier, and that leveler bar means that this right here will stay the same height no matter how much quilt you have. This is really good. It's a good thing, but it's not fun when you forget it. If you forget it, your quilt will actually be at an angle, and it's not easy to quilt that way. In fact, it's not ideal at all. So you want to make sure you go around that leveler bar. Now, one thing I'm doing is I'm laying it over the back here so I can pin it. But Loretta, if you can't get to the back, that's not going to work, right? I definitely don't want you crawling under your machine or anything. I need to take a video of this for you. Instead of bringing your quilt under the leveler bar and around, you're going to bring this leader under the take-up bar and out in front to you. So instead, okay, perfect. So you already got that. One thing I do want to point out is if you've had Jeremy set up your machine, he probably loaded it slightly different. Maybe he started up here and not the bottom. Again, it doesn't matter how you do it. You'll find your own way. And hey guys, as an aside, you should not never have spools of thread, rulers, loose threads on your table. That's not smart. And I put that there so you can see what it looks like when it's incorrect. Oh, I'm just kidding. I didn't. All right, so I have it hanging around the back, and now I'm just going to pin it to the leader again, like I did on the top. And I skipped over. Here we go. This is poor editing on my part, but so now I'm pinning it again, pinning it to the leader side, but it doesn't matter how you pin it on there, and working my way from one side to the other. You do want to make sure though, and one thing I don't show, when you're pinning your 2 sides, you want it to be even, right? So if I notice that I'm getting folds in my backing where it's kind of angling, that means that it's not the right position here. And I think that's why sometimes it's more helpful to mark that center point and use that as a reference. So anyway, I'm pinning. Life is great. Life is great. I'm hiding from my in-laws. Don't tell them. And now it's time to position my quilt where I need it to go. Now, one thing I do differently is I rotate you saw me kind of turn those wheels over there. I go until my pins are in between my 2 bars. The reason I do this is this bar will put a little bit of more tension on here, more consistent tension, and it kind of helps just a little bit prevent tucks. What I mean is if you notice these pins, if I have a gap in between my pins, I'll have like a pulling here and a pulling here, and it might be a tiny sag here. And so it won't be as tight. So, but doing that means that I'm going to need a couple more inches of fabric. So if I'm really close on my backing, I can't do that. Handy Quilter will show you how you can have the pins out front. That's fine too. That leader wraps all the way around and the pins come out here. It doesn't matter where, you just don't want those pins directly underneath your leveler bar. There's not a lot of clearance between the bottom of your machine and that bar. And if you're quilting and you feel lots of bumps, it could be because your pins are under here instead of in front or behind. Does that make sense to everybody? Clear as mud, right? Well, now that I have the top in place, then I can just tighten up the bottom part and get it to that magic tautness that I want. Okay, so let's talk about that. How tight should this be? Well, there's no certain number I can give you. You don't want it so tight that it vibrates when you're quilting. So you'll know if you're quilting and it's vibrating, it's a little too tight. So go ahead and loosen it. But you don't want it to be sagging either, because you want it to, not get tucks in it. So you want it to be smooth and taut, but not like a drum. It's not like super tight. You'll know that you're doing it too tight if you really have to crank on the bar to get it to tighten. You shouldn't have to do that. It should just get nice and taut. Now, one thing I want to point out real quick, depending on the backing, if it's a pieced backing or if it's extra wide fabric like I have here, you might load it and you might have like where part of it is taut and part of it isn't. So what's happened here is the way that extra wide backings are woven, they're not exactly flat all the time. So, or if it's a pieced back, it can mean that's not pieced quite right. If you roll it up on your take up lever and roll it back, it will kind of smooth that out and kind of even it out. All right, so you can see that's what I'm gonna do here. I'm kind of moving it back and forth just to help smooth that out. Only reason I'm doing that is, again, because it was kind of sagging in one part. You'll drive yourself nuts trying to pin it straight when that wasn't necessarily the issue. Once I get the backing on there, you can see it's nice and smooth. Then I lay my batting on top of it and I just tuck my batting up under that bar just to kind of keep it out of the way. And then I lay my quilt top on top of it. Now, instead of pinning my quilt top and rolling it around here, it's just hanging down. And that's what I mean when I talk about floating a quilt. At this point, if you have little ones, that you're afraid they're going to get into the quilt, or you have pets that seem to love the quilt on the floor, maybe doing a full load would be the way to go. And so where you have that bar, you'll just pin it to the bar leader, you'll roll it up just like we did the backing. And so instead of that quilt hanging down, it will be actually wrapped around the bar. Questions about that? So the main goal when we're quilting is to have the quilt end up square and flat. Now, that's not always going to be possible depending on the quilt if it's not pieced correctly. And if that's the case, they get one or the other, square or flat. But what I want to do is make sure when I start out, I want to make sure that this right here is perfectly straight to that bar. And I have that nice 90-degree angle here. So what I'm doing is I'm just using a ruler just as a visual guide to make sure that top is straight. Now, Handy Quilter will suggest that you can quilt a plumb line, a nice straight line to line up your quilt top. That's totally fine too. Or you can put a channel lock on one of your wheels, or for those of you who have Pro Stitcher, you can put a channel lock on and have that nice straight line. However you do it, you just want to make sure that it's straight. What can happen is if you load it just a little, off kilter, and as you progress, it's going to keep going at the angle. And if your backing isn't big enough, you can actually run off the edge, and that's never fun. That has happened to me before. All right, how are we feeling so far? This is like a quick little thing. Any questions so far, anybody? I can't see everybody's faces, so I'm imagining that everybody is just like in awe of how fun and easy it is to load a quilt. Now, when you're working on a frame situation like this, it's a little bit different than quilting on your sewing machine. Since it's not stabilized, I need to stabilize the quilt as I work my way down. And so when I'm looking at my machine, this area that I have, my throat space or my frame space, that's all I'm really worried about at this point. I'm not worried about the rest of the quilt. So I want to make sure I stabilize by quilting along the edge and along the top to stabilize it. Now, if you have, like I said, channel locks, you can use those, or basting stitches. I just use my regular stitch to work my way along and then over to the top. Now, one thing I'm doing, I'm using this ruler to hold the fabric in place, not necessarily as a straight edge. I don't care if my line is straight. I just want to make sure the quilt stays straight. And one tendency of fabric is to shift, right? Sometimes we use that shift to our advantage, but we don't want that fabric to shift. So I'm just kind of holding it in place and working my way along that. Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. So far, so good. Perfect. Now, once I work my way along that top, then I'll put my side clamps on. and then I'm ready to go. So I have it, my quilt top is loaded, it's ready to go, and now I can start quilting. The question then becomes, well, what do I quilt? We'll hit that one here in a second.
So you put your side clamps on after you do the.
I do.
Okay.
Yep.
Right.
My thought is I want to make sure if I've measured out that quilt to be perfectly square and straight, I don't want to shift anything until it's stabilized. So if you do want to put your side clamps on, make sure you put your side clamps on first and then measure it out. I just don't want to measure it out and then shift something. So that's the main difference there. Good question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Your side clamps, do you put them on the batting or just the backing?
I put them on the batting and the backing together. I don't put them on the quilt top. Remember, we want to keep that square, and you don't want them so tight. They shouldn't stretch that quilt top at all. It's just providing some consistent tension on this side because we have it so, some tension on that direction. You'll know you have them too tight if they zing off when you're quilting. If you've had that happen, I've had that happen. It's funny because like most of my clamps are busted, the pieces, it's like little nubs. And honestly, I don't use them all the time. So baby quilts, no, but definitely bigger quilts, definitely piece quilts, I'll use them. They're just there to kind of help give you some consistent tension. For those of you that are pro stitching, or if you're quilting and the backing is not quite big enough, once you get to the clamps, if they're in the way, you just unclamp them, quilt that area, and then you can clamp them back on if you need to. So they're just there to help prevent tucks and keep you going on that route. How do we feel about that? I know that was like a quick overview. I don't want to belabor the point, but I know that the loading the quilt is the first part, right? You want to be able to have a quilt on there. Real quick, what I want to do now is I just want to talk about how we're going to progress our way through the quilts. How are we going to work our way? And I'm trying to figure out how I can put my on spotlight real quick. I'll just leave it. Okay, so one thing about long arming is as I look at my frame space, this is how much I can reach with my machine. I know that some of you, like Trina, was like, oh, I only have 15 inches. My machine's only 18 inches. So, it's never big enough for sure. But when I look at that spot where my machine can reach, before I move on past it, before I advance the quilt, I want to make sure that it's all quilted or stabilized. What we don't want to do is leave a big area unquilted and roll up to the next part and then try to come back, because what can happen is the fabric can shift, and that's where you'll get tucks on the back. And that's where you'll have to call it ruching and start making up a new technique if you need to. So what that means is if I'm looking at an area that I need to skip, right? Maybe I don't know what I'm going to do in a block. I want to come back to it later. Maybe I'm switching thread colors and I'm not ready for that right now. I'm going to use some way to stabilize that area. And my rule of thumb is if it's bigger than my hand, that's just my rule. So if the block's bigger than my hand, I'll put some pins through those layers, and I'll put the pins so that they're going parallel to the bar and they can just roll in there. You can use basting stitches as well if you want. And then when you come back to it later, then you can remove the pins or the basting stitches and then fill it in. Perfect example of this is when somebody has a quilt with a border and they want to save the border for the last bit, and they want to be able to turn the quilt, or they want to do the border last. And so they do all the center, but don't do anything on the border. You can't leave it unquilted because it will stretch and it will shift, and then you'll have wavy borders. I call them friendly borders because they wave to you as you come in. So you're going to make sure you stabilize that as you go. So as you advance the quilt, I'm stitching down the sides. I'm filling in the center, my frame space, with quilting or stabilizing, and then advancing and repeating that. So I'm never quilting in that frame space if the sides aren't stabilized or stitched down, because it will suck in on itself and then we'll get a quilt that's no longer square. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, you notice I'm floating my quilt top. So how do I handle that shifting? Every time I advance the quilt, I just look at my quilt top and make sure it's not sucking up in the center. That's a normal thing that can happen. And just visually making sure that it's not. And if it is, I kind of tug it and pull it down a little bit. If you load your quilt the regular way, I know we don't have a lot of quilters that have been loaded so many quilts, but if you're trying floating for the first time, just start with something small, like a baby quilt, and see if you like it. If you don't, no worries. It's totally personal preference. How about that? Any questions? No? All right. So let's move on. Let's talk about threading the machine. Doesn't that sound like fun? Hey, all right, let's do that. 1 second. All right, so most of the machines all thread pretty much the same way. There may be an extra little thread guide here or there, but the basics of it are very, very similar. We're going to focus in on this section right here. Right here. This is where the tensioner is, and this is where we get a lot of our issues, especially when I was a new quilter. I had a lot of my issues there too. So what I did today is I put together a little video just today. So I'm going to show you just this part, just from the 3-hole thread guide to this tensioner, because this is the part right here that really can trip you up. Don't be overwhelmed by threading your machine. Get your quick reference card that came out with your machine, work through the threading steps, and it really isn't as daunting as it might seem. And one of the good things about it is when you go to switch out threads, instead of rethreading the whole machine, you can cut off your thread back here, tie onto the next one, and pull that knot all the way through so that you don't have to rethread the whole machine. But let's talk about this. So first thing that we're going to see is our 3-hole thread guide. It's very common, especially with newer quilters, where we go on Facebook or we see, what people are suggesting. Sometimes people will say, oh, I saw on Facebook I should only go through 1 of these holes or 2 of these holes. Let's go ahead and go through all 3 of the holes. Sometimes when you get into those more finicky threads, those very fine, fragile threads, you might go through just 2 of those holes. But for right now, for what we're using, we're going to do all 3 of them. So as you work your way, you're going to work from top to bottom, back to front. So I'm going to go from back to front from the top, and then wrap it around and do the next one until I go all the way down. Now, ultimately though, if it works, it works. So don't stress out too much about this. But what this is doing is it's putting the first bit of tension on our thread. It's giving the first bit of resistance. And so we want to make sure that's not snagged or getting caught up there. It should move through those holes smoothly, but with a little bit more tension. Then we're going to come to our tension discs. So right here, my little thing is right in the way, but this little tensioner right there, what I want to show you is those are 2 separate discs. You can see I'm actually stick my finger in there, 2 separate discs. And that is where we have the main tension on our thread. So those 2 discs hold the thread. And then this knob is what we turn to tighten the pressure between those discs or to loosen it depending on the thread. So that is the tensioner that you kind of think of. It's very common to forget that and not get the thread snugged up in between those discs. The way this is put together, there's a post that goes through them and the 2 discs. I want that thread to be alley-ooped up there, pulled up tight and snug against that center post. And so we're going to see that. I actually did it from 2 directions so you could see it, but you're going to go along, if you're looking directly at it, the right side, up the left side, and you're going to tug. Now, one thing I want to point out, check that out. So I pulled it up in there. I felt it was definitely flossed in there, and the thread is not sagging down here. If it's not in the tension discs, that thread will hang out down here, and that means it's not where it needs to be. You guys are going to be so tired of me saying this, but it's a very common thing. All right, so once I come down the side, then I go up. We're going to see this from the side here in a second, so this is another view. Then we're going to go in our little check spring, which is the next step, kind of up and around and down. And it should look like when you pull that thread, it should look like it's talking to you. Hey, how are you? Good job. And then up through my stirrup. So that's how I'm going to work my way through there. Now here's a side view, just so you can see a little bit there. So there's my 2 tension discs. This is like cinematography gold right here, right? Like I did this with my cell phone, but anyway, so down the side, up the other side, pulling it through there so that not hanging down here. Then I'm going to go up through that check spring. So it's not actually going a complete time around here. It's just going down and up and then through my stirrup and then up to my take up lever, which I think I get up there. Sometimes what happens is we're so excited. Oh gosh, I skipped ahead. We're so excited about getting through, that tension disc and all that. We forget the take up lever, and that will lead to not good stitches. So the reason I point this out is if those tension discs, if the thread is not in between those tension discs and you start quilting, you're going to think your tension is out of whack. And you're going to, not you, I'm sure you're smarter than me. That's what I did. I thought my tension was out of whack. So I would tighten this and tighten it, and it wouldn't do anything. Well, by the time I figured out that, oh, it's not doing anything because my thread isn't between those discs, I now have another problem to fix, another issue to come back to. And so definitely check to make sure that that's the case when you're quilting. Has anybody skipped that part when threading their machine? Anybody had an issue with that? Oh, good, Trina. Thank you. Don't make me feel like I'm the only one, right? Can't just be me, right? So was there a question or just saying yes?
Oh, I was just gonna say that was my problem when I first got it. I could not get the tension right for nothing.
Uh-huh. And and sometimes what will happen is you will thread it in there and it's perfect, but sometimes it will just work its way out. And so all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, the tension's off. Let me fix it. And we'll talk about that here in a second, but always check that. Always check that part. It's very, very common. And it's great in how it works. Very basic way to keep the tension on your thread, but very frustrating if you don't have it in there correctly. Beyond that, though, if you follow your guide and you thread your machine, then your machine will be threaded and ready to go. One thing that I tell my owners that maybe Jeremy doesn't agree with me on, but you won't tell him that I'm perpetrating this right. If your machine is working correctly and everything is fine, this is a great opportunity to go to your machine and grab the thread as it comes out of the needle. So here's the thread out of the needle, pull it directly back and feel what that feels like. It should feel very tough. It should feel tight. In fact, you should be like, wow, really? Well, fun fact, when that take-up lever comes down, that gives it the slack it needs to take the stitch. The reason you want to know is if you go to your machine and it doesn't feel like that, then there's a problem. And so let's say Deb called me because she's freaking out, her machine's not working. And I'm like, okay, Deb. So I talk her down, come to her house, and she's telling me this whole big story. The first thing I'm going to check, I won't even be looking at the needle. I'll be looking at her, but I'm going to check that because that will tell me right there. If it's super loose, it's not in the tension discs. If it snaps off at the needle, that means it's probably seized up somewhere. That's going to be my first indication that it is or isn't threaded correctly. Now, the reason that Jeremy's not a fan of that is if you pull to the side, you could deflect your needle a little bit. We don't want to bend our needle. So if you're a little aggressive, just take the thread out of your needle and pull it directly back just to get an idea of what it feels like when everything is fine, right? And so that way, as you rethread your machine or as you quilt, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly, is it threaded correctly or not? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so that is threading our machine, and that brings us to the needle. So the cool thing about Handi Quilter machines is that the needles have a round shank. That means we can put them in backwards. Isn't that fun? So fun. Actually, it is a good thing because the way the needle is set up, it allows us to make fine adjustments on it. So it is a good thing, but it can be a little frustrating in the beginning. So let's talk about what that needle looks like. So this is kind of a blurry picture, but it gives you an idea of what these needles, what we're dealing with here. So we have I'm going to pause real quick. You guys, I am such a nerd for threads, needles, and tension. I could talk for hours about it, but I won't. But if I get a little glazed over, it's just because I love talking about this. But anyway, this is the shank of our needle and it's round. So unlike a sewing machine with that flat back, it's going to go in any which way, but it does have a front or back down here. So here we have this long groove down the front. So like if you were to go up to your machine and run your fingernail, you should feel that groove right in the front. The job of that is to protect the thread as it works, as the needle goes through the quilt. Well, we all know what the eye of the needle is, right? But on the other side is the scarf. And this scarf almost looks like a C or like a divot cut out of the back of the needle. And when you're changing your needle, that scarf is going to face directly to the back. So if I'm staring right at my machine, right at my needle, directly head on, it's going to face away from me. The reason that scarf is there is it allows the machine to grab the thread to take a stitch. It gives a little bit of space so that hook can grab it. So if the needle's in backwards, it won't hurt anything. It just won't pick up the thread. So if you're having trouble picking up thread and you just change your needle, it could be that it's in backwards. Has anybody done that? I've definitely done that. Put my needle in backwards. When you change your needle, this is going to be, it's not what I want quite yet. That's a handy foot. Sorry, I thought I had the needle thing. Here we go. When you're changing your needle, this is looking directly from the front of my machine, directly back. When I'm ready to change my needle, I'm going to use that screw that's to the side to loosen that screw, and the needle will fall out. You don't have to take this screw all the way out, just loosen it up and it will pop out. Then you can take the next new one and put it all the way up in there. That's the most important thing. The needle is all the way up. And once it's up there, then I can kind of feel for that scarf on the back and make sure it's pointing away from me. One thing I like to do is if you look at the eye of the needle, it's almost like a moon. Like that's the full moon. If I twist it, it's not as big. So I make sure it's facing right away from me and it's directly that direction. Now, the way that, I won't go into details here, but the way that the stitch or the thread comes into that eye is if you are going to err to one side or the other, if you're not sure, turn it just a bit counterclockwise, just a bit. But if you've changed your needle and you're having shredding problems right at the eye, it could be a couple things, but it could also be that your needle's not indirectly straight and the thread is rubbing as it goes in. Okay. Now here's what I know about me. I was always so scared to change the needle. Like it was just like, I would put it off as long as I could because I just didn't want to do it. It's not scary. So best time to do it is in between quilts for your first time when you don't have an important quilt coming up, right? So you can kind of have time to figure that out. Handy quilters suggest changing your needle every quilt, even more than that, every 3 to 5 hours, I think it is, quilting hours. And I absolutely do everything Handy Quilter says. And in fact, my husband will come up sometimes and be like, when's the last time you changed that needle? And I'm like, oh, it's been a minute. If you have hit something with your needle and it might still feel sharp, but it might not be, it could just still be like a little dull at the end, go ahead and change it. If you're working with like interfacing, you've done a lot of like t-shirt quilts, go ahead and change it. Or if you hear a popping noise, that means that it's not sharp anymore. You want to go ahead and change it. So but again, you should be changing it regularly. They're not that expensive. And of course, Handy Quilter, or we give you 20% off all Handy Quilter things. But the next question that usually comes up is, well, what size needle should you use? Well, I'm so glad you asked. The size needle that you use depends on the type of thread. So as the thread, as the thread gets thicker, the eye of the needle needs to be bigger to accommodate that. And that groove in the front needs to be bigger to accommodate the thread. So if you look over here, we have our needle size, and I'm just looking at the 12, 14, 16, 18, or 20. And that will work over a range of threads. So right here, it'll show the 20 needle will handle 30 weight, 20 weight, 12 weight, really thick threads. Don't you love that the size of the needle goes up as the weight of the needle goes down? Come on, they could have made this the same, right? I feel like this is just very confusing. But one thing I also want to point out is you might notice there's some overlap. So look at 16 needles and 18 needles. They both handle 50 and 40 weight. That's because there's no standard weight definition across the industry. A 50 weight cotton thread with 3 plies is going to be thicker than a 50 weight monofilament polyester. So in general, just using this as a gauge. So like if I'm using a 40 weight thread and I'm having shredding with my 16, I might move up to my 18. But as long as you're within this range, that will help prevent any issues with it. In general, 16 to 18 needles will give you the most bang for your buck. They obviously kind of fill in that area of the threads that we tend to use most. But as you start getting into the very fine threads, like the 100 weight or the very thick threads, then you'll want to kind of venture out into those other needles. But all the thread packs have this on there. And those of you that have the Amara and the Forte, under the info screen, it actually has that on your machine as well. It's also on the website, so you can print that off too if you'd like. But really, just within that 16 to 18 will be the best bet for you. Any questions about changing your needles? Again, I'm not trying to go over every little bit. I'm just hitting the things that, I feel like you could benefit from. All right, so then just real quick, let's go down to the handy feet. So all the machines have the ability to change out the feet. We won't go into all the different kinds of feet right now, but you can. This uses the same Allen wrench as the needle, and you can loosen that and switch out the foot if you'd like. Now, sometimes it might be hard to make that clearance, so you can actually lift that whole thing up and get it in there. The thing to remember is you're just gonna get that foot all the way in place, and you're gonna just tighten that screw until it's tight. There's a lot of different feet out there, but it's a fun way to do different things with your machine. Has anybody changed the handy feet on their machine yet?
Nope.
Nope. So this is the one I use almost all the time. This round one that came with your machine, because the space between the needle and the edge of the foot is the same on all the sides. But if you're into ruler quilting, you can put your Surefoot on and just leave it on all the time and just quilt with it. And that's all those feet, you can quilt them on all the time. So there's that. All right, let's talk about bobbin. So this is the part where I always say, like in the training session, there's a lot of stuff to retain, but sometimes there's really important stuff. And so the bobbin is the foundation of your stitch. And if we can get the bobbin where it needs to be, then we're not going to have any issues there. So first of all, let's talk about how we put our bobbin in the bobbin case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bobbin and I'm going to imagine that it looks like a 9, right? So that thread is coming over clockwise. It's coming off to the right side, but I just see it as a 9 because that's how I was taught. That's what Grandpa said, looks like a 9. So that's what I do there. Once I have that the way I need it to be, I'm going to take that bobbin case and from behind, put it in there and position that bobbin in. Now, you notice I wasn't too worried about where my bobbin thread was coming out. Once I have it in there, then I can find that little slot and feed it into that slot and under that little arm. As we can see right under there and under that little arm. What that arm is doing is it's adding tension to our thread. So we have the ability to change the bobbin tension as well as the top tension. That's fun too. But once you get the bobbin tension set, you shouldn't have to adjust it unless you change bobbin threads. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here in a second. We'll talk about how to do that. But any questions about how to put your bobbin in the case? One of the great things about being a dealer for so long is we've seen a lot of different situations. And we had one owner that was just struggling. We couldn't figure out why her tension was just so intermittently not good. And she had her bobbin in backwards. So you definitely want it to go in the correct way. Let's back it up a bit. I want to show you one quick thing. The newer bobbins right here have this little anti-backlash spring in it. Like Deb, I don't know if yours has it. Mine doesn't have it. But any of you that have just got your machine will have this. That little anti-backlash spring is pretty cool. It keeps your bobbin up no matter how light it is as it gets emptier. But if you happen to drop your bobbin case and that thing pops out, you can put it back in. Or if it pops out and a cat runs off with it or the kids destroy it, you can still quilt without it. The reason I point that out is sometimes we don't realize it's in there until it pops out and we're like, holy crap, where did this thing come from? So when we're putting our bobbin in, we want to make sure that our bobbin is tightly wound. Here I'm using a pre-wound, but you definitely want to make sure your bobbin is wound correctly. If you're quilting and you're having thread issues and they're intermittent, like sometimes it's fine and sometimes it's not, it's just so random, it's most likely a bobbin. So if you wind your own bobbins, you want to make sure there's no squishiness to them. It needs to be wound evenly. And if a bobbin is bent, like let's say you have a tile floor or a wood floor and you dropped it and you always have trouble with the same bobbin, it's dead to you. Throw it in the trash. It's not worth the struggle. It's for that reason also, if just use Handy Quilter bobbins. We give you 20% off, so you'll use them. Even though the M bobbin is a classification over the standard, just use the ones that go with the machine. It will save you a lot of issues. Now, I know there was a question about the bobbin winder, Mary. Basically, the bobbin winder stops halfway through or snaps the thread. Is that correct? So yes. You have the Moxie, and gosh, I can't remember. Talk to Jeremy because there is most likely an auto off setting on that. And like, especially the other bobbin winders too. If that auto off setting is pulled in a little bit, it'll automatically kick off when it thinks it's full, even though it's not. And nobody only wants a half full bobbin, right? We want that thing full. So yeah, talk to Jeremy and see if he can't figure that out. And if it's snapping, there must be something with it. So don't struggle with that. Email Jeremy and have him talk you through how to get that great, or use pre-wounds. I always say pre-wounds are like the kind of like drugs, right? You can't just stop at one. So the reason I love pre-wounds, they're industrially wound, so they hold more thread, and they're always wound right. Every once in a while, you'll have a weird one that doesn't work right, but for the most part, but they can be more expensive. So you have to kind of wrestle that.
Yes, question.
Yeah, go for it.
So when the thread on top, like if I want to use, let's say an 80 weight in the bobbin, I know there's pre-rounds for like, I can't remember the one I saw, that's an 80 weight kit. Will that work as long as it's the right, class of bobbin or?
Yep.
Okay. Right.
Yes,
right.
you can mix the weights of thread on top and bottom, the types of thread, the colors of thread. You can do whatever you want. M size bobbin will be the classification. Sorry, I dropped my shoe. I'm trying to get it. It came undone and now I'm trying to get it back on. Sorry, hold on a second. No, nothing. Nothing like live, right? I should have just left it. Anyway, so yeah, you can definitely do that. And so I use 60 weight pre-wounds because that's just what I like to use. You can buy them in more in bulk. And so they're a little bit thinner, but it's totally up to you. And I think maybe the next owners meeting I do, I'll just do threads, needles, and tension. We'll talk about threads because I can talk all about that. But yeah, you can mix it up and do whatever you want for sure. Good question. Any other questions about putting the bobbin in the bobbin case, winding your bobbins? So one quick little caveat is if your machine is on like a hardwood floor or tile and you don't have a rug down, it's very common to drop your bobbin case. And so if you drop it enough, you could bend it. And you want to make sure if you're having issues, that's something you might want to check because it could be bent in there. Basically, when I hold my bobbin and I pull my thread, it should move smoothly. It shouldn't seize up. It shouldn't stop and start. It should just move smoothly. And if those little prongs are bent in, that will give you trouble. But again, we'll just cross that bridge when we get there. But as long as your bobbin is wound correctly, that will save you a lot of struggle. And we'll talk about bobbin tension when we do tension at the very end. I have to save that for the end. That way it's the last thing I put in your brain. All right, any questions? Any more questions? I'm not making things more confusing, am I? It's a fine line. It's a fine line by sharing info and confusing the heck out of y'all. So, okay, let's go back to my screen. All right, so when we're looking at our bobbin case, this little screw right here is how we're going to set the tension of our bobbin. And any adjustments that we make to our bobbin are going to be like seconds on a clock. I said I wasn't going to talk about it, and look, it was next on here. So I'll talk about how you check it at the end. But it basically, if you're going to adjust your bobbin tension, that's where you're going to do it. And it only needs a little bit, like I said, a second on a clock. It does not take a lot to adjust the tension. So that's just how you're going to adjust it. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Left to loosen, right to tighten. All right. The only maintenance you really need to do on your machine is to oil the bobbin area. So this is where the bobbin case goes into. This is the bobbin housing. So it's hard to see, but there's a little ledge right here. And if you look at your machine, you can kind of almost run your fingernail right there. And this assembly in there rotates while the outside stays stationary. We just want to put a drop of oil right there so that as it rotates, it lubricates that mechanism. And you really should oil the machine 1 drop each time you change your bobbin. You really should, especially if your machine gets loud and you haven't, you probably should. It was really great when I lost my oiler. And so I was like, Jeremy, do you have another oiler I can use? And he's like, when did you lose it? And I was like, look, for the interest of our marriage, let's just not have me answer that question. So it's important. But if you put too much oil in it, doesn't hurt anything, but your first few stitches will be really sloppy. And I think that's something that doesn't really get expressed very well, I think, in some of the training videos. So it's okay. It just means like if you always change your bobbin and you always have issues at the very start of your bobbin, it could be that you have too much oil in there. And if that's the case, just go to the edge of the quilt on the batting and just quilt a little bit until it runs through. It just needs a drop. But, I'm just doing the spray and pray. I'm just getting there, squeeze it in there. But it should be kind of in that ledge. It needs to be machine oil. Your machine came with a thing of oil that will last forever. But, if you can't find it, you can order another one for 20% off, or any machine oil will work. Any questions about that? Everybody's oiling their bobbins, right? Right. Yep. Good. Do as I say, not as I do. All right. Let's talk about putting the bobbin into the housing. The fact that you all have quilted a little bit on your machine means that you know how to do this, but it's going to make me feel better to tell you this anyway. So your bobbin case that's holding that will only go in the bobbin area one way. Now, you can force it, but you don't want to. So it should only go in one way. Don't push too hard. It should fall right in. And here we have a little video I did, just kind of the underside of the Amara. Now, the Amara has a lighted housing, the Amara and the Forte, which is great for filming. My Avante doesn't. So if you get to your machine, Moxie, and you're like, why can't I see? That's an add-on there. But when I go to take my bobbin case out, I'm going to lift that little latch and pull it out. And when that latch is pulled open, the bobbin won't fall out. So that's good. You just hold that latch, pull it out. But when I go to put it back in, I'm looking to that little divot on the side, and I'm going to put the whole thing in there, but I'm not going to use the latch to hold it. I'm not going to keep the latch open because I want to hear the snap. And if you have that latch open, you won't hear the snap that it makes when it goes in. That's the most important thing. Most important thing I can tell you about this whole training session. If you only remember one thing, this is it. So you want to make sure, sorry, let me see if you can hear it. Basically, I'm gonna take it out. Yay, we see that. Put it in, you want to hear the snap. The snap means that it's all the way in the position it needs to be. And even if you don't have it in there perfectly, you can rotate it till it falls in. So wait for it. That's what you want to hear. You want to hear that snap. Now, every time I change my bobbin and I put it in there, I hear that snap. And you see how I grabbed that thread and pulled it a little bit? That's a habit of mine too. I pull that to make sure that it's in there correctly. If that thread is seized up, that means the bobbin's not in there right. Or if it's so loose, I know it's not in there correctly. So it's just letting me know, am I heading into a train wreck? So that's totally an aside there. The reason it's so important to hear that snap is if that isn't all the way in that housing area and you start quilting, the needle will not be where it needs to be and it will hit something and it could throw your machine out of time. It can be fixed, but it's not fun. It's not cheap. So you want to hear that snap. I have been, I don't know, Deb, you might've been there. I've done training, live training, and I didn't put it all the way in and I started quilting and I broke the needle and everybody was like, oh my gosh, what happened? And I was like, it's Deb's fault. No, I didn't. I had to admit to them that I totally didn't put it all the way in there. So it's very important that you make sure you do that. Sometimes it'll be fine. Sometimes it won't. So how do we feel about that? All right. So let's talk about pulling up thread and then we'll talk about tension and answer any questions you have. So real quick, when you start quilting, if I just go to a spot and I just start quilting, I'm going to get a nest at the bottom of my quilt. I need to pull up my bobbin thread to the top so that I can handle it there. And so when I say breaking thread, I just mean I'm tying off and tying on. Breaking thread just sounds more aggressive and a lot more badass, I think. So maybe that's why I say it. But tying on isn't usually the hard part. It's usually the tying off that gets people tricked up. And the problem is I have to say a lot of words to describe it. I promise if you just come back to this part and watch it a couple times, if you're struggling, soon you'll be able to do it in your sleep. Okay. So again, I know I have to say a lot of things, but it really is not as bad as it looks. Okay. And then we'll talk about the tie off button too for you, Wendy, as well. Okay. So let me share my little video. Oh, that's not what I want. All right. So let's say I'm starting in the middle of my quilt and I want to start a new line of quilting right here. I'm going to position my machine with the needle directly over that spot, wherever I want to go. Those of you that have the Amara and the Forte or the Amara and the Forte have a laser light that will show you. It's not necessary, but it's nice. I'm going to position it where I need it to be. And I'm going to pull up the bobbin thread by holding my top thread. I'm going to talk through it and then show you the video. I'm holding my top thread. So my thread, it's hard to see here, but it's through my bob or needle. I'm holding it. And I'm going to take one stitch. So I'm going to pull it where I want it to be, holding that thread. And I'm actually crossing my arm over to my needle up and down button. Those of you that have the Amara or Forte have the programmable buttons. You could put that needle up and down over on your right side. But I'm just taking one stitch down and up. So I'm pushing that needle up and down button once and then twice. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'm going to go down and up. I just want to take basically one stitch to grab that bobbin thread. So now it's hooked around. And as I move the machine over, it's going to pull up that bobbin thread and I can grab them both and have them in my hand. Oh, I skipped ahead. Hold on. Sorry, guys. Does that make sense to everybody? How I'm pulling up? Okay. So now I have my bobbin thread on the top. That's great. And I'm going to bring the machine back to where it came out. I'm going to take a few stitches in place. And I'm just doing that to help kind of secure my quilting. So here I have them both up. I'm going to bring them back. And if you hold that needle up and down button, if you hold it down, it will take a few stitches in place really slowly if you'd like. Now, those of you that have the Amara and the Forte have the tie off button. That tie off button, if you push it on the front screen and touch it and then you nudge your machine, it will take those stitches in place for you so that you don't have to hold the button down. That's what that does. It's basically just replacing me holding my needle up and down button, taking those stitches. Does that make sense, Wendy? You look confused. Basically, I have to hold the button down to take those few stitches in place. Your tie off button will take them for you automatically. If you push the tie off button and then nudge the machine, it will do that. Does that make sense? But some of us don't have that. So we have to actually hold down the button. So here's the question that normally gets asked. I'm taking a few stitches in place. that's all I'm doing. I'm not burying my threads. I'm not knotting them. I'm not gluing them. I'm just going to start quilting from there, and I'll come back another time and just snip those threads off flush with the quilt top. That's how I've done every quilt I've ever quilted, because you all know me a little bit by now, right? I'm not a person that's going to bury threads. If that is concerning to you, you can put a drop of freight check on that knot. But I always say, like, if you've ever taken out quilting, you know that stuff doesn't just come out, right? 2 seconds to put in, 20 minutes to come out is usually the ratio of ripping out quilting. Trina, yeah, you know it. So every stitch is like a little knot. So I don't worry too much about that. Now I do try to start in a seam, like you can see right here, or off the edge of the quilt. But ultimately that you have to wrestle with that and come to what makes you happy. Okay, so gosh, I need to stop pushing buttons. Now I've tied off. I made my knot. I can start quilting. And here we're just gonna pretend that I've quilted until I need to tie off again. Maybe I've finished my block, and I'm gonna do everything I did before in reverse. Okay, so let's talk through it. I decided, oh, here's where I wanna stop. So I'm gonna secure my line of quilting. Oh, there's me cutting off my threads. I'm gonna secure my line of quilting by taking a few stitches in place. Again, just to kind of knot that up, not a whole lot, just 3 or 4. Or Wendy, you could push the tie off button, nudge a machine, and it would take those for you. So now I've secured it. Now I need to trim my bobbin thread, but I have a problem. My machine is connected to the bobbin thread. I can't really pull it up. So what I'm going to do is give myself some slack on the top and move my machine over, right? So the needle's in the up position. I'm giving myself some slack, and I'm moving over a good like 6 inches or so. You want to give yourself some slack here so that I can grab that top thread right here. So I've moved it over. I'm grabbing that top thread. So now it's like I'm holding the top thread like I did the first time. And then I'm going to bring the machine back to where I came out. Does that make sense so far?
Mhm.
Again, it's a lot of words, but I'm going to hold that. Now, when I'm holding that top thread, I'm not pulling up, because if you pull up, you'll pull that knot right out of the quilt, which is not the end of the world, but we want to hide it. I'm just holding it. And then I'm going to bring the machine back over. Again, I have my finger looped. There's that top thread looped right there. I'm coming back to that same spot, and I'm going to take my stitch down and up, and that's going to grab that bobbin thread for me, down and up, and move it over. Okay, so here's where I'm at. I have my top thread. I'm holding onto it. I have my bobbin thread, which is still connected, but it's there. It's pulled up. I have 2 different threads going on here. Then I'm going to cut them flush with the quilt. All right. Here's how you know. How do you know if you've done it right? You know you've done it correctly if you come away with one little piece of thread. Should be about 1 inch or 2. If you don't come away with one piece of thread, you haven't cut it, go ahead and try it again. Here you can see there's the 2 threads, trimmed it, and there's my extra little piece. If you don't get that bobbin thread cut, it will be still connected. And those of you that have done it know what I'm talking about, right? It's all the way connected over there. Do you want me to talk through that again? Or is that clear as mud? It's not fun to explain it and then not get to do it for you guys. But again, you should not have to reach under your machine to trim your threads, and you should be able to tie off, break thread wherever you are. Now, when I tie off right there, that's allowing me to secure my line of quilting. But what happens if my bobbin runs out? I can't really secure my quilting because there's no bobbin to grab, right? I'm going to start my next line of quilting so that it overlaps that previous line of quilting by about 1/2 inch or so, and that will help secure it. So that's how I handle that instead of knotting it up. How do we feel about that? I mean, Deb, you've had your machine for a while. I'm sure in the beginning you can remember it was hard, but then now you can just do it without thinking about it, right?
Yes. Oh, and one other thing I was going to say when we were talking about floating quilts, I bought that netting hammock thing. I think that is so worth the price because A, it keeps everything off, but B, if you drop things like your bobbins and stuff like that, it catches it. So
Yep. Thanks for pointing that out. I totally forgot about that. So when a quilt and that batting is all hanging, they make a handy hammock, which is different than a banana hammock, right? But it keeps everything up off the floor.
is it?
It is. You guys, I have a slightly questionable sense of humor. It's actually worse when we're not recording, but I got to keep it engaging so you guys don't fall asleep, right? So yeah, that does help keep it off of there for sure. Another thing I have, and I don't know, you probably couldn't see it in the video, I have an anti-fatigue mat that Jeremy bought me in front of my machine. So it's like a restaurant quality rubbery mat. And so if you're quilting a lot, it's definitely worth the investment to have to help your feet. When you're quilting, your feet should be the first thing that hurt. It shouldn't be your hands or your back or your shoulders. If that's the case, you're hanging on too tight. You should be able to quilt with your fingertips. If you're clenched, use your fingertips because you can't clench your body with that. So that's not even in my notes. That's just an aside there, right there. So tying off and tying on, again, just work through it a couple times. And if you're struggling with it, just try to always do it on the edge of the quilt if possible. And then once you get the hang of it, it's really, really pretty easy. How do we feel about that? Now I actually do have, let me real quick. This is a second video. I have another video. So let me just show you one more and we'll see if that maybe clears it up a little, maybe just seeing it a little bit different, a little closer. So here's the same thing. I'm going to where I want to start. I'm pulling up my thread, taking a few stitches in place, and I'm going to start quilting. And so just going right into it. And then I try to remember to grab those tails and cut them before I move on, but we know sometimes I forget. So that's me tying on. I don't know. Hold on. I don't know if I have a tying off. Nope, I don't. So that's the only tying off one I have. I might have to try to do one that's closer for you guys eventually. All right. How do we feel about that? We've changed our needle. We've done all the things. We've changed our foot. We're quilting. I'm going to go ahead and talk real quick about some of the questions you asked. And then we're going to talk about thread issues and tension, because that's the #1 struggle. And then if you have any other questions, we'll hit them for you for sure. Okay. So we'll talk about struggle things. Okay. Struggle, Mary, when this goes for everybody, how you're quilting at your machine, especially your long arm, it's a totally different movement than on your sewing machine. So fortunately, I went right from hand quilting to long arming. So I had no preconceived notions of quilting on a sewing machine, but I did have to go back and learn it, which was not fun. But I did. So when you're quilting, you have most control when your hands are directly in front of you. And one very common thing is we don't want to move our feet. And so our hands start doing this. The problem is we're going to have to stop. So as I'm quilting, I'm taking baby steps to keep my hands in front of me. And so kind of focusing on that will give you the most control, especially as you're getting comfortable using your machine and working with it. Now, it came up a couple times. What about the boxy swirls? What about getting used to the movement of the machine? I am so sorry, y'all. You bought this beautiful shiny machine, and I'm going to tell you it takes practice. I'm sorry. I wish I had something for you. Wine does help. No. The machine that you have comes with different stitching modes. And so I'm going to just touch on them briefly, but I will tell you that if you are consistently trying, like you're like, I'm going to get the swirls. I've been doing it and they're still boxy. No matter how hard I try, it could be the stitching mode. You can try switching that out. So first of all, your machine comes with what's called a stitch regulator, right? And usually that's what I tell newer quilters to start with, the stitch regulator, because that will allow the machine to speed up and slow down with you. So your stitches will all be the same size, right? And everybody's so happy with that. The problem is sometimes it feels like you're pushing the machine or you're trying to nudge it to go. And especially those of you that have the Moxie or like the Avante, like I do, doesn't have quite as powerful motor. You really got to nudge it to go. And Deb too, like that HU16. So you might not get that smooth, fluid movement like you need with swirls. Anything that's round, you have momentum is your friend, right? So if you think about my 2 sets of wheels, I have one going horizontal and one going vertical. I'm trying to engage them both at the same time. That's like trying to do it with an Etch-a-Sketch. That's not easy, right? But it does get easier. So you might find that working in manual mode might be easier for you. So manual mode means that when I turn the machine on, it's going to go the same speed no matter how fast or slow I move that machine. And that's going to give me organic stitch length. I always quilt in manual mode because that's how I learned. I didn't have a stitch regulator. Back in my day, you could add a stitch regulator onto your machine for $3,500. And Jeremy was like, no. And I figured I already got the long arm out of them. There's no way to push it. I know where the lines are. So anyway, I learned without it, but I can get that nice, smooth movement and the sound. Was it you, Mary, or Loretta? It was talking about the sound of the machine. For me, I love the consistent sound. So I don't know if this will help, but I did record a quick clip of each mode and I'll show you the difference between it. But if you have learned to design and you're trying, you might try manual mode. Now, every quilter is different. I have owners that have never left stitch regulated. I have owners that went right to manual. It's like settings on a car, right? We're just trying to give ourselves the best ride and we're all a little bit different. Right, Wendy, I could see you probably have your seat in your car set way back. You're probably cruising to your beads. I know, right? I might sit like, I drive like a granny. I drive like this, so it doesn't matter. It's your different settings. So don't feel like you have to fit into a certain place, because that's not it. But we can hopefully try to find the setting that works for you. Okay, so I don't know which one's which. Let's see what's okay. This is the manual mode. So regulate. This is the regulated mode. So as I speed up and slow down, the machine is going to speed up with me. This is great if you are learning a design. This is great if you need time to think through it, or consistent stitch length is very important to you. Those are perfect. I always say newer quilters, newer long armors should start out and stitch regulated, because it gives you time to think through the next couple steps. But that sound, you hear that sound, that speeding up, that slowing down, I don't love that. I'm weird like that. And I like the more consistent movement. Especially if your motor is not as powerful as others. Okay, so then here we have manual. Oh, sorry, this is cruise. Gosh, guys, I'm sorry. This is the cruise function, which is in between manual and stitch regulated, kind of combines the two of them. See how it's still stitching when I stop, every time I stop, it's still stitching really slowly. It's preventing me from having to give it that nudge to go. So if I'm doing something with a lot of points, you might like the cruise. So that's a different stitch regular option. If I have stitch regular precision and manual, that cruise is just kind of in between and lets you kind of play around with that. But if I have my manual, you see here, sorry, I know it's loud. Notice it's the same speed. So if I'm doing really small designs, I need to slow my machine down. If I'm doing really big ones, I can go a little bit faster. But it also means that I'm getting stitches that maybe aren't all the same length. Of course, I don't care about that. I'm not a perfectionist. So there is that. So manual might be for those of you that are struggling with your boxes, you're getting your smooth momentum down. Or if you're consistently outrunning your stitch regulator, especially those of you that have a Moxie. If you've been stitching in stitch regulator or quilting in stitch regulator and it beeps at you, anybody have that little beep? That means you're going too fast for the stitch regulator and you're outrunning it. I get that all the time and it drives me nuts. So, because I'm going too fast for the stitch regulator. So if you like to quilt fast, manual might be your option. Now, as you are finding your sweet spot, everybody's different. Isn't that great? It makes it so fun. I can't tell you, oh, you should do this setting, because it depends on the design and your preferences. But you can adjust the machine speed to your hand speed and try to keep your hands going the speed you feel comfortable and adjust the machine to that. And you can do that either on your handlebar or on your menus by adjusting that speed. I know that's like a quick little overview of it, but any questions about that? I know that in every group of quilters, I like to do psychoanalysis on quilters, but there's always the rule followers in every group that's like, just tell me what to do. Tell me the rule. And so my suggestion for new quilters is to use precision regulated, which was that first option. And I say about 11 to 13 stitches per inch. It's a really good place to start. The reason it's not great to start in manual is if you're learning a design and you hesitate, you'll get more shredding thread in that situation. So you need to be pretty comfortable with that design or have your finger on that start stop button. I have worn out the little sticker on my button from pushing it. It's all cracked. So, and I use manual even when I'm using rulers all the time. So again, it's up to everybody's own personal preference. Any comments? Go ahead.
Do you think it's like starting with stippling or for practicing and stuff like that? It just, okay.
So like, what should you start with? So that kind of leads into CJ's question. Like, there's two different things, right? There's learning how to use your machine and actually like, what do you quilt? How do you pick the designs, right? Like that's a whole different thing. So I'm going to give you an answer. You're going to think I'm being a smart ass, but you should practice what you like to quilt. You're like, great, that doesn't help. Okay, so that aside, let me say this. I don't love meandering. I don't love stippling. It's boring to me. So I never really did that. I went right into swirls. I'm like, I'm gonna learn how to do swirls. So that's where I was. So you can start with any design that you like to quilt and that you think that you might like to use it. The good thing is this is not quite like math in which we're building off previous learned. You don't have to do meandering before you can do a swirl, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But that being said, I'm going to maybe make this a little more confusing. Some quilters tend to like designs that are very repetitive in the way they go together. design, like step 1, 2, 3, 4. As long as I do this, it's always going to look right. I know Wendy well enough to know that's probably where she's at. Wendy, like I love her. We're the opposite sides of the same coin. So she makes sure I stay on point, get stuff done right. And I remind her, you don't have to be perfect, right? Sorry. You know, I can call her out because we've worked together a long time. If that's the case, you might find geometric boxy designs more fun, like a geometric all over. You might find concentric swirls. Again, I don't have that stuff with me to show you. Something like that. But I'm more like the other style where it's like, just wing it, just fill it in, fill it in. If that's the case, a basic swirl is a great option. Oh gosh, a flower meander is a really forgiving one. The problem with it is it's a lot of change in direction. So you got to get the booty shake going. Make sure you use a whole body to do that. That would also be a great topic for another long arm meeting, because this has come up before. And so I think maybe if I just put together, like, follow these steps, these are the designs you should work, maybe that might help. I will say 80% of quilting is just knowing where you're going. I mean, I completely made that up, but I think it sounds right. So if it's just, there's something that you already doodle in real life, if you always doodle leaves, then that's a great place to start. If you always doodle swirl, if you don't doodle in real life, then that's not going to help you. But I have always been a compulsive doodler. I've always drawn on like little just designs. And so, you know, if there's something you're already comfortable with, you might find that more helpful. I think starting with an all over meander design is a great way to get most bang out of your time. Like you could learn how to do wishbones and back and forth lines, but then you've got sashing designs and you really probably want something you can do over a whole quilt. So swirls, flowers, a good option, leaves, you know, and I'm not to plug myself, but you can go back and watch any of the Free Motion Challenge quilting alongs and try a few designs. Load a quilt about a panel or piece of fabric and try some different designs. And whichever one makes you feel less like throwing up, that's the one you should probably stick with and practice that one until you get comfortable with it. But once you learn that design, once you learn like a swirl or a loopy or a meander, whatever it is that you learn, then build off of it, right? So let's say Wendy finally gets the swirls down. Well, maybe then she throws in a leaf every once in a while just to feel comfortable with it. And then maybe, you know, then she's doing a leafy meander, no problem, you know. So the thing that sucks is that it sucks to suck, right? And you're in that point where you're like learning and instead of, it's so easy for me to say because I'm on the other side, but kind of enjoy the process and try not to be too hard on yourself. I always tell people in my classes, if once you finish quilting an area, look at it and pretend that my 11-year-old daughter quilted it and then see what you would say to somebody that did that was 11, right? You would be pretty nice to them, right? For some reason, we're very hard on ourselves. Sorry, CJ, that's not a good step, rule 5, you know, to follow, but I can make you a training sheet if I need to. I'll definitely have to do that. But Deb, do you have any suggestions? I mean, I know you've had your machine for a little bit. Are there designs that you would suggest them to start out with? You're on mute, honey. If only there was a mute button for you in real life. No, I'm kidding.
I love the swirl and I love it when combining with some pebbles. I think it always gives a great texture. I don't have any problem with the swirls. That damn feather can just throw me for a loop. But anyway, swirls are my favorite.
Yep.
And I think they always look good.
Mm-hmm. It's really versatile. Like there's not a quilt that wouldn't look great with a swirl. And it's fairly, the actual shape of it is repetitive. So unlike a feather that has like 4 different steps, 4 different shapes you're combining. Not saying you can't start with feathers, but an all over, a loopy kind of design will be a great option.
And an elongated one I just think it's gorgeous. I mean, I use it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I would say as you're quilting, and see, I don't have the design how-tos, but I will tell you, the thing that will help you is looking ahead of your needle. You don't want to look right at the needle. You want to look in the direction you're going. It's hard to get used to that, but that will help you see where you're going. And when I say momentum is key, I mean, like, that means not stopping a lot. So like, you know, not stopping to critique the job you're doing. Go ahead and finish that whole area and then stop. Just keep that forward motion. Hopefully that helps there. Okay. Tie off boxy swirls, what to practice. Okay, Deb, so let's talk about thread issues, tension, hit that big old thing right on the head and talk about maybe what some of the issues they're causing. So before we can talk about tension issues, or, we need to understand what good tension is. And if you've had your long arm for any amount of time, chances are you've dealt with a thread issue or a tension problem. If you haven't yet, congratulations, but it's probably coming. The way that we are working this machine and going all different directions, it just lends itself to every once in a while having issues. But the good thing is, the more comfortable you get with your machine, the more comfortable you get with the idea. It's a learning curve, but then it clicks and then you won't have issues anymore. So I promise, sometimes it doesn't feel like that when you get to that, when you're struggling with it, but you'll get to that point. So first, let's talk about what good tension looks like, because this is a silly little thing, but good tension is when the top and bottom thread meet in the middle of the quilt. Now, that's not very much room for error, right? If we think about how thick our batting is, that's not really good. So we want those two threads, the top and bottom thread, to meet in the center, not above or below, because that's bad tension. And so we need to make adjustments to make that happen. Now, once we have our bobbin tension set, once our bobbin is where it needs to be, and if you're quilting and everything is fine, then don't touch it. Any adjustments should be made on the top thread, right? So all the adjustments, the little tweaks that you make, especially if you're changing thread. So if we think about the thread, if we see the bobbin thread on the top, like if we imagine that that's that tug of war, right? So here's my top thread, my bobbin thread. If it's doing this, I need to loosen my top thread, right? To ease it back into the center of that quilt. And I'm going to do that by turning that little tension knob that's on the side of my machine. Now, the adjustments I can make on that are going to be bigger. They're going to be like a half a turn. You can make a bigger adjustment there. Now, why would you need to change your tension? Most often, it's because you change types of thread. So if you go from one thread to another, you may have to make some slight tension adjustments. You're going to look at your quilting. You want to see a perfectly formed stitch. If you see the top thread where it doesn't need to be, or the bobbin thread where it doesn't need to be, then we need to adjust that tension to put it back where it needs to be. So for instance, if I go to a thicker thread, I need to loosen my top tension and give it a little bit more room, right? If I keep eating all this ice cream, I need some bigger pants, right? I need a little more room in my pants to do that. So that's how I'm going to make those adjustments. If it is just changing your type of thread, it won't be a lot of adjustments. Most often where people get into trouble is we have what's called a thread issue. And a thread issue is usually what we call bad tension, shredding, skip stitches, things like that. And so that will happen and we think, oh, I need to adjust the tension, and that might not be the case. So if we understand how tension works, we can get a little bit more comfortable with spotting times that it's not necessarily a tension issue. Okay, so here's the takeaways. If you have a tension, your tension's off, you've changed threads, you're going to make adjustments and you're going to test. So loosen and test until it comes right in the center where you want it. And then you're going to only adjust on the top. The only time you should adjust the tension on your bobbin is if you change the type of thread in your bobbin. So really 90% of the time, this is just my number, but this is just me. The only time you should adjust tension is if you've changed types of thread. If you go from a glide flint to a glide warm gray 4, it's going to same thing. You shouldn't have to adjust tension. The other 10% will be if you're dealing with a different kind of quilt. Sometimes you have to make tension adjustments. For instance, if you have a quilt with batik fabric, which is tighter it's a tighter weave, and you might have to loosen it a bit. So sometimes it isn't just changing the threads, but it'll be because of a quilt. Maybe you're using thicker batting, but it shouldn't be a whole lot. The reason I want you to adjust and test, because if you've adjusted it a few times and it's not making a difference, that's not the problem. Okay. So I'm telling you from my standpoint. So I should go back. Since some of you know the story, I think Deb might and Wendy might. When I got my long arm, I didn't have the dealer, I didn't have this set up, and I am very easily frustrated. I'm what you call a fast sinker. I am great. Everything's fine. It's sunshine and rainbows. But once I start going down, it's like, and I would go upstairs about once a month crying. Seems a little dramatic now. Sell that piece of crap. I'm done. I hate it. I hate everybody. Like, I just couldn't figure it out. And I was doing everything wrong. So what I'm going to try to do is tell you things to help make that process a little smoother. But there are going to be times you're going to get frustrated with your machine. You're due probably for about 3 or 4 good freakouts if you're if you're better than me, right? So I do want to say, if you're struggling, don't struggle alone. Don't spend a crazy amount of time struggling. Call Jeremy, call the shop, email, get some help. That's what we're here for, to help ease that. If you're having thread issues, the good news is there's a 99.9% chance it's a small thing. The bad news is it could be one of 100 small things. Okay, so I wish I could make a flow chart that would tell you how to fix every thread issue, except they'd all just end and have another drink of wine, right? Like no matter what the problem was, the answer would be that. But I am going to give you a practical way to approach those. And if you can do that and then call us if it gets too much, then we'll be there to help you. So let's pretend that you're quilting along and all of a sudden you have a thread issue. So Deb's thread issue is that her bobbin thread keeps sliding out of her slot and we can't figure out this issue, right? So, or whatever the problem is. The first thing I'm going to say is, if you were to call me, I'd say, well, it was fine and now it's not, and something has changed. Now, sometimes you'll know what that was. Sometimes you won't, right? But something has changed. So it was fine. What has changed from the time it was working until it's not? Now, if you call Jeremy or we get on the phone or, Deb calls me crying, which she has been known to do. No, I'm just kidding. I can pick on her because she's such a good sport. If we ask questions, it's not because we're doubting you. It's just we're trying to play detective. Okay, so did you do this? Did you do that? So something has changed. So for instance, in Deb's example, we're going to try to diagnose this. It wasn't doing it and then it was. Did you change types of bobbin thread? Did you change bobbins? Like what do you know if anything has changed in between?
I think probably it had to do with the fact that my thread had broken earlier and I probably threaded it incorrectly. But I've had problems with that before, just random keep slipping out kind of thing. I don't know why.
Okay. So usually, like I said, if it's a random thing, it is most usually in the bobbin area. So if your tension is bad sometimes, but not all the time, it's not a tension problem usually. Usually it's a thread issue. If your tension is off, it'll be off all the time. So when you have an issue and you're like, okay, I'm going to try to problem solve this, try one thing at a time, only one, and test it. The reason is I would try back in the day 4 or 5 things and then get frustrated because I was either counteracting what I've done or I wouldn't know what fixed it. Right. So one thing at a time. In fact, if you want to, you can get a spiral notebook and write the issue. Thread keeps sliding out of the bobbin case and write down each thing you do and whether it worked or not. The reason being, let's say you do have to call Jeremy. And if you're like me and I get that fast thinking, if I get upset and frustrated, I'm not thinking very straight. So it's nice to have a list. Like, here's what I've done. Right. Wendy has witnessed that. Right. She has seen me do that. I'm like, everybody go home. I just need so it's not pretty. So having that list will help me see what I've done, but also let me see what fixed it. Or if the problem is a threading, I didn't have it threaded correctly, I now know what to do to take it back. So in Deb's example, I would say, okay, great, let's switch out the bobbin. Is it doing it on another bobbin? It could be that there's one bobbin in your pile. Do you use pre-wounds or you wind your own?
Wind my own.
So it might be that there's one bobbin in your pile. You don't know which one it is. Maybe it is bent. Maybe it's, and so it seems random because it just depends on when it gets pulled out to be used. That could be it.
When you were talking about when you thread it and it goes through and it hits that little arm, should it go underneath that arm then?
Yep.
There's my problem. There it is right there.
Yeah, I'm surprised you're not having more tension issues though, because it needs to fit under that little arm. You guys, everybody know what we're talking about on the bobbin case where it goes under there. Another thing that can happen is as we quilt, dust and lint can get up under that arm and it could raise it up. And so it'll be under the arm, but so you can use like a piece of paper and just feed it in between there and see if any fuzz comes out. And then
I think I've been taking it to just that point, but I don't think I've taken it underneath that arm.
I would be really surprised if you haven't, because you would have way more trouble than you've had. But yeah, try it.
Yeah,
it needs to be under that because that gives it tension to it.
Maybe I just did it and didn't know I was doing it, and now
or what could happen is, let's say Deb does figure out it's not underneath the arm of her bobbin. Yay, now she's got that fixed, but now her tension on her bobbin is a lot different than it was, and that means her top tension probably will need to be adjusted too. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like a cascading thing.
Gotcha.
Another thing to do is, okay, so something changed and then but we don't know what it is. Also look to where the problem is happening. So if her thread is coming out of her bobbin case, it's probably not a top thread issue. It's probably not the spools of thread she's using on the top. We're going to look right where it's at. So for instance, shredding, Loretta was having a problem with shredding with your thread. Is it shredding like at the needle or at the take up lever? Can you tell like where usually is like where it's shredding at? Sometimes you can tell, not all the time.
I usually notice it at the needle.
Okay. So then that's where I would start looking, right? Maybe the needle needs to be changed. I'd change it and
Okay.
try it. Maybe the needle is just tilted one way. It needs to be straightened up. Maybe it's just not the right size. Maybe you had, so like trying each of those little things and see like any one of those could cause it. It's just hard to know which one. Now, when you're quilting, are you quilting like straight lines or what are you actually quilting? Just anything like
remember.
leaves or swirls or?
The last time I did anything, I was doing ruler work.
So one of the things, and I don't know if this is it, one of the ways that the mechanism is in the bobbin case, the way that hook works is the machines do not do a great job quilting straight lines from right to left over long periods. I'm not talking like a couple feet, but let's say I want to do straight lines over the whole quilt and I go all the way from left to right. And if I come back right to left and it's shredding, that's actually just because it does that. And so I need to always go left to right. That's only with straight lines. And that's only with long straight lines. You can quilt all different ways with your design. It's just those long straight lines right to left. So that could be, but if you're not doing that, then that wouldn't be the case. You should be able to go quite a while. And sometimes over the whole quilt, it just happens randomly.
It could be, I just need to change my needle.
Yep. So have you switched types of thread?
Nope.
Okay. So I'm guessing it's probably the needle. So like switch out the needle, change the side, but again, one thing at a time and then test it. Is it doing it all the time or just randomly?
It was, I'm trying to remember when I was doing it. It's pretty random.
Yeah. So like if you were saying, I can't go, but 5 inches and it shreds, that's probably going to be more like a needle issue. Or, but if you're like, every once in a while it's shredding, it could be a threading thing. It could be the thread has gotten under behind one of those little guides when it should be in front of it.
I've noticed that it gets caught in the little silver thing that comes and
kind of hops out of there and gets behind it. And any little friction, as far as quick as that machine or that thread is moving back and forth, any little bit of friction can cause that shredding. And so, especially if you're going, like I notice whenever I'm going from front to back, maybe that's when it's popping out of there. So I know it's not very helpful, but try changing the needle first and then see if that helps it. Another thing that's so very important is just so important to use high quality machine quilting thread. We're going in all different directions. We're putting stress on that thread. And if we're using thread that's not built for that, it's going to give us a lot of struggle. So I always say, if it works, it works. So if you're using Glide, which we love, so find something made for multi-directional machine quilting, you should have an easy time. But I know sometimes we're like, ooh, I have serger thread laying around, or I have embroidery thread laying around. That's not as strong. Now, sometimes it works, and if it works, it works. But if it's not working and it's not good thread, you should probably switch it out and see if that does it. So I always say you can skimp on a lot of stuff, right? Don't do that. Don't do it on the thread. It will save you.
I only use your thread.
It's so good. And Glide is so cheap, and it's used to get 20% off, and it's so pretty. Like, it's so gorgeous.
It's so
I don't want to brag, but Wendy gets to look at all the different colors in her shipping room, all the colors. So the thing is, I know that it's frustrating when it's not working the way you want it to work. And I don't want you to deal with that frustration alone. We could lay out every single thing, but it's just going to be more overwhelming than anything. So having those couple things to get you started, and then knowing that if you're struggling, contact us, because it's pretty fun, because Jeremy will say, hey, such and such called and this is what was wrong. Guess what it was? And I'm so like, try to guess it. And sometimes we learn things too. Like, oh, we haven't had that one before. That's great. But I know that for some of us, and I know I'm this way, I would like, I don't want to call. I'll try to figure it out. Don't struggle alone, right? I don't want you to struggle. And our best case scenario is that you call and it's a silly, easy fix. That I hope that happens. We hope that's the case, that it's an easy fix. So even if it's like, oh man, I had the needle in backwards, I should have known that. No, that's great. There's no judgment. So please don't struggle alone. But ultimately, the more comfortable you get with your machine, the smoother you move it, the better it's going to do. And the perfect analogy I have for that, I have an analogy for everything. It drives my family crazy, but I have a car and it works fine. But when my son learned how to drive, my car wasn't doing too great. It was like all over the place, and well, he wasn't comfortable with it and he wasn't driving it right. So just know that some of that stuff will work itself out as you get comfortable with your machine and moving it. So Deb, try that and let me know if that fixes it, because
Okay.
I want to know if I was right or not.
Okay. You
Um,
will be. You will be.
no, not always, not always. It's funny because I've been quilting for a long time, right? So I got my long arm when Drake was 6 months old and he's almost 20, guys. Like, so weird. But Jeremy is so very technical minded. So it's kind of interesting. We're the perfect partnership, but we're also the perfect storm. So sometime I'll be like, you should listen to me. And sometimes he'll say, anyway. Kira, you were having a nest of thread on the back when you're pro stitching. Is it doing it like all the time? Is it on a specific design or direction?
No. So
It's just
I,
random?
over the weekend, I did 3 or 4 quilts,
Mhm.
right? And thankfully it only happened on one, and it was the one I was keeping for myself, but like 2 or 3 rows in, all of a sudden, like every 2 or 3 feet, like it would just get a little nest, and I'm like, what the heck? I didn't notice until I was done.
Yeah.
But the machine didn't sound weird or anything like that. There was nothing tripping it up. Oh, you know what though? I
What?
did clear out some lint from one of the feet, like underneath one of the wheels.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I'd gotten that caught in a weird way that it was like stopping.
Could be. Is it always doing it like on the same direction? Like, let's say you're doing like a Baptist fan and you notice like every time it does it, it's when you're going right to left or up, bottom to up. Sometimes that happens too.
Do
you know? Or is it, sometimes it's hard to know. Like, I know sometimes these questions are weird, but
It was a light colored thread on like a solid.
well, what I'll have you do, email Jeremy or text him. I know you got his number, and see if he can help you figure it out. Usually when it's intermittent like that, the nesting on the back is probably the most problematic, because it's like, it could really be anything. It could be as the bobbin, maybe the bobbin as it was winding, it was kind of loose at the very beginning and then it was fine. So it looks good on the outside, but as you get to the inside, it's not. It could be, sometimes it's like the anti-backlash spring. If you put that in backwards, it could actually not work as good. It could be sometimes, and I don't think this is the case, but I'm just throwing out stuff because, I'm full of it. But the pro stitcher, sometimes it's the design. Like if you notice, it's always this design that does it. It could be the way that it's designed, or there's something in it. But that's about all I've got for that one. I know that you've had your machine a while, so I know it's threaded correctly, and that's not like that's the problem. So
Yeah, most likely bobbin. My automatic, I hate that. I mean, I love it because it works, but like I hate it because it's very finicky and I don't do very good at it.
okay, I guess I need to do a video on how to use it, because it really is good if you but if it's giving you trouble, there's just something that needs to be fixed on it.
No, just like getting it started. I always like, I loop it like 3 times and I'm like, did it go? Did it go? No.
Okay, so do you put the thread through the little slot
What slot?
on your
All
bobbin?
right. No, please make a video.
I will. So your bobbin has little slots on it. And so again, I don't have a bobbin winder here, but I'll do this for you guys. The Moxie's a little different too. The bobbin winder is different. So I got to get my hands on that. But I put the bobbin on the post and the thread from the inside out one of the slots, so that's hanging out a little bit. And I hold on to that thread. When I hit start, it'll make a few revolutions and then you just pull that thread down and it breaks off.
That slot?
Yep.
I don't know where my camera
Yep.
is.
There should be one on each side. It doesn't matter, either one.
Okay, so you just put it through and then you hold it.
Yeah, that's going to change your life. That's a problem. I'm sorry. I'm
Mind
so sorry.
blown.
You were even here for the boot camp. See, like all the things I think of, like, oh, I'll do a video for you, Kira. That will change your life.
Pre-rounds a lot too. so.
Yeah, the pre-wounds are great. And then even though like pre-wounds, they're tighter wound. So even though it's the same weight, you might have to adjust your tension a bit on your bobbin for the pre-wounds, because it needs to be a little bit looser. So, but good. I'll show you. I'll do one and I'll look up, because I know there was a question about the Moxie bobbin. Can't remember who asked that, but I'll do something for both of those so we can see how to use them. But like if the bobbin isn't always winding right, then that will definitely give you some issues. So good pointers. Guys, that's a lot of information for me to throw at you. I'm fine with it because I already know it all, but it's a lot to take in. Are there any questions? Anything where you're like, oh, this doesn't make sense? Everything I said made perfect sense. Now I know you're
Yes.
lying. No, I'm just kidding. I always say that means I did a great job or a horrible job. I think the problem is, when you're taking information, you only can retain like 80% of it or 20% of it. You lose a lot of it. So as you're working through your machine, please get on the Facebook group. Please look on the page, watch the video again or watch previous videos. I'm working on pulling out the individual sections of each training video so you can jump right to how do you thread the machine or how do you make it a little bit user-friendly or more user-friendly for you. But ultimately, I know we can't always get all the time we want to do the quilting we want to. Sometimes real life gets in the way, but if you're struggling, please let us know because we want to make sure you're happy with your machine. So if there's no questions, no more questions. All right, well, I'll let you guys go for tonight, and I will be putting out dates for upcoming Long Army meetings. I've kind of taken the summer off, which is it's been a crazy summer. But about once a month we get before the summer, we do a Long Army meeting and I'll teach something, I talk about something. And so you're welcome to join that and I record those as well. So just be on the lookout. I'll send out those dates sometime this week and looking forward to watching you all grow in your machine quilting journey and love seeing what you're doing. So keep it up. Okay, everybody.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank
See y'all
Thanks.
later. Bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.